facing backlash from fellow Republicans. But some Democrats, of course, are seizing on Congressman Justin Amash's comments. Joining us now to talk about this and so much more, we have Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who serves on the Judiciary and Foreign Services Committees. Great to have you here in our new studio.
To be with you. Gorgeous new studio.
Thank you very much. We just cleaned it up for you. Okay, were you surprised to see a Republican, Justin Amash, saying that the president, saying so overtly that the president did engage in impeachable conduct?
I was surprised to see a Republican congressman saying publicly what I think many are thinking privately, which is those who have read the Mueller report cannot avoid the conclusion that the president and some of his absolutely core advisors engaged in profoundly disappointing, reprehensible conduct that would rise to the level of an obstruction of justice charge if he were anyone other than President of the United States.
But you don't think that Republicans are thinking that privately, do you?
Yes.
What makes you say that?
Conversations.
So it's not so private.
There are very few who would be willing to say publicly that this conduct is reprehensible for a president.
But you have spoken to Republicans who have shared with you that they think that it's also impeachable.
There's a big difference between thinking that the Mueller report reveals conduct that is deeply disappointing, inappropriate, even borderline or actually illegal, and saying they would vote to remove the president. I have not spoken to a single Republican senator who would vote to remove the president. Many privately expressed concerns about what was in the Mueller report, in part because of the gap between what Attorney General Barr characterized as being in the Mueller report and what was actually in the Mueller report for those who've taken the time to read through it.
Well, he laid out evidence of behavior that at least our legal analysts say for anyone else, any other American, would be prosecutable.
Right. I think that's an unavoidable conclusion, particularly for those, and there's quite a few in the Senate, who are former prosecutors themselves.
Do you agree with Congressman Justin Amash that it rises to impeachable conduct? Because I don't think you've gone that far to say that you think that it is impeachable.
Well, there's a conclusion I've reached, which is that impeachment is a political process, and that, frankly, the likelihood that the known jury in this case, the Senate of the United States, would actually remove the president is close to zero. If the Mueller report had produced a bombshell, I think there was a chance that the Republican majority Senate might have removed the president. In the absence of that, we have a simple choice to make, which is, do we spend the next year and a half trying to legislate and putting forward proposals that would actually solve middle Americans' daily problems, or do we spend the next year and a half fighting with each other over a political process that will not produce removal?
And very quickly, before we move on, do you think that Justin Amash's comments change anything?
I think it's going to raise a question again in the minds of lots of voters. If they're represented by a Republican congressperson, is my congressman, is my congresswoman someone who's, willing to stand up to the president when it really is in the best interests of our country, our system of rule of law? Are they willing to just level with me and tell me honestly when the president does something that is beyond the pale?
Okay, let's talk about what's happening with Iran. The president over the weekend threatened this. If Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again. He tweeted that. A lot of people will hear that as the president being strong, that telling Iran, you can't mess with the United States. How do you hear it?
I think it was exactly Donald Trump who, when President Obama drew a red line in Syria and then didn't act, said repeatedly, great powers can't threaten, can't bluff. This is unacceptable. He is doing much, much worse. He is using Twitter to amp up the rhetoric and the potential for conflict with a country, say DPRK and Kim Jong-un, and then doing a 180, amping it up in Syria, amping it up in Iran, amping it up with Russia. And he goes back and forth, and as the world has seen, all it takes is a couple flattering comments, and he'll reverse himself again. I'll remind you, the most respected national security leader in the last decade, probably, the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, resigned over the way in which President Trump abruptly decided to pull us out of Syria while there were combat operations underway without consulting our closest allies. This is a man whose Twitter-led national security leadership has unstabilized our core alliances, has concerned our national security apparatus, and I think is exactly why we need Joe Biden as our next president. We need someone with some stability, predictability, and relationships among our core allies.
Last week, when you were on New Day, you said that you, on the Foreign Relations Committee, had not been briefed, had not
Right.
gotten an intelligence briefing. You'd asked for it,
Right.
but had not received an intelligence briefing. Have you had one?
I was able to see some printed materials late last week about Iran's aggressive behavior in the region. I will tell you, I frankly learned nothing from that material that I didn't learn from the news. There is going to be a hearing, a classified briefing later today on Afghanistan, and an all-senators briefing, I believe, tomorrow on Iran. We still have not heard any strategy from this administration. The president bluffs about going after Iran. Taking on Iran militarily is a very challenging prospect. We need to have a serious conversation about the costs, the risks, and the plan. So far, there is no plan that I've seen or heard of.
But from what you've seen or what you've heard, do you believe that it was Iran that was being provocative and that provoked the U.S.? Because there's a question about how this escalated so quickly. Some people have even suggested that maybe there was a misunderstanding or that the U.S. did something to provoke Iran. Which one do you think it is?
I think that's a legitimate question and exactly the sort of thing that we ought to be discussing in a classified environment. Exactly why it's so important for the administration to come forward and to brief a broad group of senators who are able to question them is to force them to focus their strategy, to make key decisions. I think it is an open question whether or not the provocation is going one way or the other. And this is a very small space and a real tinderbox. The Strait of Hormuz and the area between Saudi Arabia, Iran, there are so many other players in this region. The war in Yemen has been so destructive and is essentially a proxy war between Iran and the Saudis already. We are already enmeshed in the conflict in Syria. I think it is critical that we play our hand here thoroughly, cautiously, carefully, and recognizing that we face an enormous challenge from China and a real and sustained challenge from Russia. If we were to get drawn into a war with Iran, the consequences for our global position would be, I think, tragic.
Senator Chris Coons, thanks so much for being here in studio.
Thank you, Alex.
Great to